right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just a little housekeeping. These webinars are intended for educational purposes only, and while we hope that you learn new information, the trainers presenting these webinars are not attorneys. Therefore, all information provided during the presentation and during the Q&A session should not be construed as legal advice. All right, well, now that we got that out of the way, good afternoon. My name is Brianna Grimes, and welcome to our webinar talking about going to the polls, voting leave laws, and political tension in the workplace. I am a senior HR advisor for Pay Entry, and I'm really excited to present this training to you today. So today we're going to be talking about the voting leave laws, any state-specific voting leave laws, so we'll kind of go over those a little bit more in depth, dealing with political tensions in the workplace, how to manage conflict, that comes from those political tensions, any steps that you can take as an employer to help alleviate them, and then we will end with a Q&A session. All right, so it is that time again where Americans everywhere are exercising their right to vote. So let's talk about the specific laws surrounding voting leave. Now, surprisingly, there are no federal laws providing time off from work to vote. Those laws are actually mandated by your state and local jurisdictions. So these laws will vary greatly. But don't worry, in the handout section for this presentation in the webinar, we actually created a little cheat sheet with all the state laws, so you can download that, find your state, and you'll see exactly what you are required to provide. Now, keep in mind that some states may require leave and others, some states may require leave and others do not mandate it at all. Also, some state laws require employers to pay non-exempt employees for their time, while other states allow the time off to be unpaid. The laws will also dictate the amount of time an employee is permitted to take off in order to exercise their right to vote. Some states even dictate whether or not employers can specify when the time can be taken off to vote. The majority of states allow employers to limit the time off to either the beginning or the end of their shift, or whatever makes it easier to manage the leave from a business standpoint. But regardless of the state leave law, if an exempt employee takes partial days off to vote during normal business hours, they should not have their pay reduced due to the FLSA classification. So keep that in mind regardless of whether your state allows for voting leave or not. All right, so there are 20 states in total that do not have any type of voting leave laws, which means 30 states have these laws. So if your state is on this list, the voting leave you allow, if at all, is up to you, but you are not required to offer it. Remember, you can always allow leaves that are not mandated by the state by adding them to your employer handbook or simply making an announcement. If having your employees engage in exercising their voting rights is important to your organization and the culture, then feel free to allow them to vote during work hours and specify the amount of time and if it will be paid or not. But again, if your companies if your companies work in any of the states that are on these lists, then you do not have to provide the voting leave. Now, although the voting leave laws vary slightly from state to state, here are the most common specifications surrounding these laws. The majority of states with voting leave laws allow employers to designate when an employee may vote, whether it be at the beginning or the end of the shift, or any time after 1 p.m. You get to designate that specification. It doesn't matter. This is really just to ensure that the voting leave does not interrupt your business operations. In addition, the majority of states do require the time to be paid to non-exempt employees. That is the most common law that you see amongst the states. However, the time required is usually no more than 2 to 3 hours, and it can be less. If they only take 30 minutes to go vote, then you only have to pay them for the time that they use to vote. Here are some examples of the laws that you will see on the handout. So we'll take a look at 2 states. First state is Texas. So their specific law says that employees must be allowed time off and be paid for that time. If the polls are open for 2 hours before or after their work shift, the employee is excluded from this requirement. So if you have someone who works a regular 9-to-5 job, I know right now, I think for the early voting, the polls are open Monday through Friday from 7 to 7. So if they work 9 to 5, they would be exempt from this requirement because the polls are open 2 hours both before and after their work shifts. All right, now let's take a look at New York. So in New York, employers must allow 2 hours to vote and pay employees for time unless the polls are open 4 hours before and after the employee shift. And employers can mandate voting before or after the shift. So in my previous example, if you have an employee that works 9 to 5, and the polls are open from 7 to 7, obviously that employee would not be exempt in New York because 7 o'clock is only 2 hours before 9 o'clock in the morning. So you would have to allow them time to have time off to go vote. However, employers are able to mandate to employees, hey, you can take this time off to vote, but we need you to do it either in the first 2 hours of your shift or the last 2 hours of your shift. You can't take it in the middle of the shift. So you have that legal obligation, or excuse me, that legal right to exercise that specification. Now, keep in mind that in order to be compliant, some jurisdictions may have other pieces to their law that you will be required to comply with. For example, some city or state jurisdictions do require postings to advise employees of their voting leave rights that are mandated by the state. In addition, some actually require employers to provide time off to employees who serve as election officials, or serve in an elected office. So it's good to keep in mind and know which compliance aspects will apply to your local city and state jurisdictions. All right, now let's talk about another aspect that typically surrounds this event every 4 years, and probably this year more than others: political tension in the workplace. Political parties are more divided this election, and it can cause issues in the workplace. Generally, politics should not be discussed in the workplace, and you can make it known that the topic is inappropriate during work hours. However, a SHRM survey recently found that more than 50% of working Americans say that discussion of political issues have become more common in the workplace over the past 4 years. In addition, 1 in 10 workers say that they have been treated differently because of their political views or affiliation. This is something we as employers have to be very careful of, and we don't want these situations to erupt into a harassment or a discrimination claim. In some states, political affiliation is a protected class under the state laws. Another great reason to try to avoid political discussions in the workplace is because about 31% of employees who talk about them report feeling stressed or frustrated, which we know from many other studies decreases work performance, satisfaction, and overall employee engagement. And the really sad truth about all of this is that 36% of workers say that the 2020 election has led them to avoid talking to another coworker. And in an age of collaboration, innovation, and working relationships being pillar to successful businesses, we really can't afford for our employees to refuse communicating with each other due to politics that really don't belong in the workplace to begin with. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, what's the problem? I have a right to freedom of speech, and if I don't like people who support a certain candidate, that is my prerogative. Well, in fact, 80% of employees believe that their political conversations at work are protected by the First Amendment, when they're actually not. Free speech under the First Amendment only extends to actions by the federal government. There is no protections for employees of private employers. And when employees are on employer time, employers are permitted to regulate employee actions and freedoms to an extent. For example, you are free to have a glass of wine at home on the couch in front of the television, but not at work. Having a glass of wine at work could get you fired. Employers are allowed to dictate how employees use their time during work hours because they are paying the employees. So taking political and religious discussions off the table is totally permissible. In addition to that, any tensions in the workplace environment impacts your company culture and overall productivity. Political tensions in the workplace can cause things like decreased productivity and morale, workplace bullying and harassment, disengagement, high turnover, at the very worst, lawsuits, and negative perceptions by customers who might be overhearing some of these conversations. So, how do you deal with these conflicts? Well, as we said before, people have a right to different political views, but they're not allowed to create hostility or conflict in the workplace because of them. The best thing to do is to manage the conflict. Don't avoid it. It will only get worse. Here are some tips for how to manage political conflicts that may occur in your workplace. Address the issue as you would for an issue of diversity and inclusion and not politics. The differences in our organizations is what allows us to be innovative, collaborative, and keep each other in check. No human on this planet is 100% right 100% of the time. It's okay to have different opinions, but those should not affect your company's commitment to diversity. It's okay that we're not all the same, and it's good to encourage your employees to see it that way. Take the time to reinforce your current policies for harassment and discrimination. Remember that in some states, political affiliation is a protected class, and discriminating against or harassing someone for it is taken very seriously and it can be disciplined. Political tension can also create a hostile work environment, which is against federal laws surrounding harassment. So be sure to reiterate the consequences to employees whose conversations tend to get a little out of hand because of their political passions. Now, if you decide that you will allow political conversations in your workplace, here are some things to keep in mind and possibly regulate as far as rules go. Set the rules that discussions are okay, but debates are not. Maintain civility at all times. Agree to disagree and enforce no hostility or aggression policies. Given the current political climate, a lot of these rules are being justified as needing to be broken, even on social media platforms. So my professional recommendation is to simply not allow political discussions during work hours. If the employees want to do it in their free time, at lunch, or on breaks, they can. But during work hours, they need to be focused on work. Be sure to take appropriate disciplinary actions against those who are eliciting harassing behaviors or against those who continue to discuss politics after being told not to. They may be creating a hostile work environment and can open up your company to litigation, which is something we want to avoid. Well, that is all I have for you on those two subjects. Again, we do have that handout included for the state voting leave laws chart for you guys as a cheat sheet if you have multiple states that your company is located in, or you want to look at the very specific law for your state. So before we end today, let me see if we have any questions at this time. It looks like one of our attendees had it in their calendar that this webinar was how companies are helping working parents during COVID. Yes, so if there was any miscommunication, I do apologize about that. This webinar was originally scheduled to be how companies are helping working parents during COVID-19, but due to election week coming up next week, we did rearrange our schedule a little bit. So we did reschedule that webinar, and I believe it is not next week, but the week following. So that webinar still will happen. If you guys signed up for that, feel free to re-register because we still are doing that webinar. All right, well, thank you for your time today. Please join us next week for onboarding documents. We're going to talk about I-9 compliance, the 2020 updates, and best practices. And then we are doing a very special mini-series in December. We are going to be talking about state updates for 2021. So we have 5 Tuesdays in December that we were going to be covering all of the state updates. So go ahead and go on to our upcoming webinars. Each of the state mini-series is labeled with the states that will be covered in each. So take a look at what state applies to your organization and sign up for that mini-series. We're very excited to give you guys the updates for any laws that are changing in 2021 and any laws that may be going into effect because of the election happening in November. So feel free to join us for both. We're very excited to start this mini-series. But thank you all for your time today. I hope you guys had a lot of good information presented to you, and you guys have a great rest of your week.